Emma Caldwell thought she'd left her troubled past behind when she escaped the small town of Blue Ridge, Georgia. But a family funeral pulls her back, forcing her to confront the pain she fled, an estranged father, a broken friendship with her childhood protector Alex, and a town that never forgot her sudden departure. As Emma navigates old memories and lingering resentment, she encounters Marcus, a young boy whose struggles mirror her own as a child. Determined to help him, she finds herself drawn back into the community she once rejected. Along the way, Emma wrestles with guilt, the weight of lost connections, and the question that haunts her. Can she make amends for the pain she caused, or is it too late to rebuild the relationships she abandoned? With every act of kindness, Emma begins to see that healing is a two-way street. But will her efforts to mend fences with Alex and others be enough, or will the scars of the past prove too deep? Emma Caldwell tightened her grip on the cracked leather steering wheel of her aging sedan, the hum of its engine a steady background as she approached the familiar sign welcoming her to Blue Ridge, Georgia. "Home of Southern charm," it read, though the charm Emma remembered had often felt conditional. The sight of the rolling hills and quaint downtown stirred a mix of emotions, nostalgia, and dread, interwoven so tightly that she could not separate one from the other. The air was crisp, and golden leaves swirled along the roadside. Emma glanced at the clock on the dashboard. She had just enough time to stop at the old house before heading to the funeral. She dreaded seeing the place but felt compelled, as if the answers to questions she had long avoided might be hidden in its weathered walls. She turned down a narrow gravel road, the tires crunching beneath her. The Caldwell house emerged through the trees, its once bright white paint now faded and peeling. The porch sagged slightly, and a broken swing hung lopsided from rusted chains. Emma parked in the overgrown driveway and stepped out, her boots sinking into the soft earth. Inside, the house smelled of dust and age. Her father's possessions lay scattered, evidence of a man who had stopped caring long before he stopped living. Emma wandered through the living room, her fingers grazing the edge of a worn recliner. She remembered him sitting there, stern-faced, flipping through the local news, rarely speaking unless it was to issue a rule or correction. In the corner, she found a box labeled Emma's Stuff. It was unexpected her father had never been sentimental. She knelt and opened it, finding old drawings she had made as a child, ribbons from spelling bees, and a faded picture of her in her high school graduation gown. A lump formed in her throat as memories flooded back. "Why did you keep this?" she whispered aloud, her voice cracking. The sound of tires on gravel broke her reverie. She stood quickly, brushing dust from her jeans, and peeked out the window. A familiar truck had pulled into the driveway. Alex Brennan stepped out, his broad shoulders and easy posture instantly recognizable, even after all these years. Emma's heart raced. She had not seen Alex since the day she left Blue Ridge. He had been her closest friend, her protector, and the person who had made the oppressive walls of her childhood feel less confining. Their friendship had been a lifeline, one severed abruptly when she chose to escape, leaving Alex and everything else behind. As he approached the porch, Emma opened the door and stepped onto the creaking boards. "Emma," Alex said, his voice low and steady. His green eyes searched hers, a flicker of emotion visible before his expression hardened. "Alex." She crossed her arms, suddenly self-conscious. "I heard you were back," he said. "Didn't think you'd actually come." "Neither did I." She forced a small smile, but it faded under his unyielding gaze. He hesitated, then gestured toward his truck. "Figured you'd need a ride to the funeral. The church parking lot's packed." Emma blinked, surprised by the offer. "Oh, thank you. I can drive myself." Alex shrugged. "Suit yourself." He turned to leave but paused at the bottom of the steps. "You should know. People around here haven't forgotten what happened. They'll be watching." His words stung, though she knew they were true. The weight of her past was not something she could simply set down, even after all these years. The funeral was held in a modest church at the edge of town. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the pews. Emma sat near the back, avoiding the curious stares of the townsfolk who whispered behind their hymnals. As the pastor spoke, Emma's mind drifted. She thought about the last argument she had with her father before leaving for college, his voice sharp and unyielding as he accused her of abandoning her family. At the time, she had thought leaving was the only way to survive. Now, sitting in the pew, she wondered if she had been right. After the service, Emma lingered near the exit, unsure where to go next. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention, and she turned to see Mrs. Jenkins, her childhood neighbor, smiling warmly. "Emma, dear," the older woman said, her voice soft with kindness. "I'm so glad you came." Emma managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. It's good to see you." Mrs. Jenkins reached for Emma's hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "I know your father wasn't the easiest man to love, but he did care for you in his own way. Don't let regret weigh you down, child. You've always had a good heart." Tears pricked Emma's eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you. That means a lot." As Mrs. Jenkins walked away, Emma felt a small sense of relief, like a thread of hope had been woven into the fabric of her grief. That evening, Emma returned to her father's house. She sat on the porch, staring out at the darkening woods. The stillness was both comforting and suffocating. She thought about Alex, his guarded demeanor, and the unspoken pain in his words. He had every right to be angry, but something about his offer of a ride lingered in her mind. In the distance, she heard the faint sound of laughter. A group of children was playing at the creek, their voices carrying through the trees. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. It reminded her of a simpler time when she and Alex had spent hours skipping stones and talking about their dreams. "Why did I leave you behind?" she whispered to the night. As the stars began to appear, Emma made a silent vow. She would not let her time in Blue Ridge be consumed by guilt and avoidance. She had come to bury her father, but perhaps there was something else to be unearthed, a chance to make amends, to rebuild, and to find the part of herself she had lost. The morning air was crisp as Emma stepped onto the porch, the damp wood cool beneath her feet. She cradled a mug of coffee, her breath mingling with the steam as she stared out into the dense woods that had both terrified and comforted her as a child. The silence of the small town pressed against her, a stark contrast to the bustle of Atlanta, where she had spent the last 10 years. Her father's house felt like an artifact of a forgotten era, and being here, surrounded by his things, brought memories she had buried deep. The box she had found yesterday sat on the kitchen table, its contents spilling out like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. She thumbed through the drawings again, lingering on one of a house with a big red door and flowers along the walkway. A scrawled note in her childish handwriting on the back read, "For Daddy." A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Startled, Emma set the drawing down and opened the door to find Mrs. Jenkins, clutching a small basket of muffins and smiling warmly. "Good morning, dear. Thought you might need some breakfast," the older woman said, stepping inside uninvited but welcome nonetheless. "Mrs. Jenkins, you didn't have to—" "Nonsense," she said, placing the basket on the counter. "I figured you might want some company. It's not easy being back, is it?" Emma hesitated before answering. "No, it's not. Everything feels heavier than I expected." Mrs. Jenkins nodded knowingly. "That's the past for you. It has a way of clinging to us, no matter how far we think we've run." She eyed the box on the table. "What's this?" "Some old things of mine," Emma said, picking up one of the ribbons. "I didn't think he'd kept any of it." Mrs. Jenkins's face softened. Your father may not have been good at showing it, but he was proud of you. I remember him bragging about your college scholarship to anyone who'd listen." Emma's chest tightened. "It didn't feel that way when I left." "No," Mrs. Jenkins agreed gently. "It didn't. But people are complicated, Emma. Even the ones who hurt us." The conversation lingered in Emma's mind long after Mrs. Jenkins left. She found herself wandering through the house, drawn to her father's small office at the end of the hall. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a cluttered space that smelled faintly of tobacco and paper. Stacks of yellowing receipts and notebooks were piled on the desk, but it was the corkboard above it that caught her attention. Among the bills and faded calendars were newspaper clippings about her. One was from her high school debate team win, another from the announcement of her college scholarship. Emma reached out, her fingers brushing the brittle paper. She hadn't spoken to her father in years, but here was evidence of a quiet pride he had never voiced. The sound of a truck pulling into the driveway startled her. She peered out the window to see Alex climbing out of his old pickup. Her heart thudded as she met him on the porch. "Alex," she said, trying to sound casual. "I came to check on the house," he said, his voice guarded. "Make sure everything's holding up. The roof looked bad last time I was here." Emma frowned. "You've been looking after it?" "Somebody had to." He shrugged, avoiding her gaze. She stepped aside, letting him pass. Alex moved through the house with a familiarity that made Emma's chest ache. He inspected the kitchen pipes, tested a creaky window, and made notes on a scrap of paper he pulled from his pocket. When he was done, he turned to her. "You'll need to get that roof patched soon, or it'll start leaking. I can give you the name of a guy who does good work." "Thank you," she said, hesitating before adding, "and thank you for looking after the place. I didn't know." Alex nodded, but said nothing. He moved toward the door, but Emma stopped him. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Alex, I know I left without saying much. I know I hurt you. I didn't mean to, but I—" "You don't owe me an explanation," he interrupted, his tone sharp. Emma flinched but pressed on. "Maybe not, but I want to give one anyway. I was scared. I didn't think I could survive here. And leaving it wasn't about you. It was about me trying to find a way out." Alex sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I get it. I do. But you didn't just leave this town, Emma. You left me." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. For a moment, Emma couldn't speak. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. Alex looked at her, his green eyes softer now, though still wary. "It's in the past," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He stepped outside, leaving Emma standing in the doorway, the faint sound of his truck fading into the distance. That evening, Emma walked to the creek where she and Alex had spent so many summers as kids. The water was clear, reflecting the deep orange of the setting sun. She sat on a large rock near the edge, her thoughts swirling. Flashbacks of those carefree days with Alex surfaced, their secret hideaway under the old willow tree. The hours spent skipping stones, the promises they made to always have each other's backs. Her father's voice interrupted the memory, sharp and unforgiving. "Stay away from that boy, Emma. He's trouble." But Alex had never been trouble. He had been her refuge. As she sat by the creek, Emma realized how much of her life had been shaped by fear. Fear of her father, of staying in Blue Ridge, of becoming someone she didn't want to be. But fear had also cost her things: her friendship with Alex, her connection to this place. For the first time in years, she let herself cry. When she finally stood, the sky was dark, the stars just beginning to peek through. She wiped her eyes and headed back to the house, her steps lighter than they had been in days. She didn't know how to fix the past, but she knew she had to try. The next morning, Emma stood in the tiny kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The house felt less suffocating in the daylight, though the silence was still heavy. She had spent most of the night replaying her conversation with Alex, her regret gnawing at her. His words echoed in her mind. "You didn't just leave this town, Emma. You left me." She turned toward the window, catching sight of a weathered path leading toward town. It had been years since she walked those streets, but the pull of familiarity tugged at her. By late morning, Emma found herself standing outside a small diner, its windows fogged from the bustle inside. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Rosie's Diner," and the aroma of fresh coffee and fried bacon drifted out as she pushed open the door. The interior was unchanged, a long counter with red vinyl stools, booths lined up against the walls, and a jukebox humming faintly in the corner. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Alex, seated at the counter with a cup of coffee in hand. Emma hesitated, her instinct to retreat clashing with her desire to bridge the growing chasm between them. Before she could decide, a cheerful voice cut through her thoughts. "Emma Caldwell, is that really you?" Emma turned to see Jamie, a waitress she remembered from her teenage years. Jamie's bright smile and warm demeanor had been a constant in the diner, and now, years later, she looked just the same. "Hi, Jamie," Emma said, managing a smile. "Well, sit yourself down. I'll get you some coffee," Jamie said, motioning to a booth by the window. Emma obeyed, sliding into the booth and setting her hands on the table to steady herself. She tried to ignore the way Alex's eyes flicked toward her before he turned back to his coffee. A moment later, Jamie appeared with a steaming mug and a knowing look. "I heard you were back in town. You've got folks talking, you know." Emma sighed. "I figured as much." Jamie leaned in conspiratorially. "Don't mind them. People around here love to talk, but they've got short memories when kindness comes knocking. You just got to give them something new to talk about." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Kindness?" Jamie grinned. "You'd be surprised how far a little kindness can go. Trust me." She straightened, glancing toward Alex. "Speaking of kindness, why don't you and Alex hash things out already? That boy's been sulking ever since you walked back into town." Emma's cheeks burned. "It's complicated." Jamie smirked. "Life always is, honey, but you don't fix complicated by avoiding it." With that, Jamie sauntered off, leaving Emma to stare into her coffee, her stomach twisting. She glanced toward Alex again, and this time their eyes met. He looked away quickly, but the brief connection emboldened her. She stood, her legs trembling slightly, and approached the counter. "Alex," she said softly. He turned, his expression neutral but guarded. "Emma, do you mind if I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the empty stool beside him. He hesitated before nodding. Emma slid onto the stool, clasping her hands tightly. "I didn't mean to make things worse yesterday. I wanted you to know how sorry I am." Alex sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed ahead. "You can't change the past, Emma." "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'd like to at least try to make things right." For a moment, Alex said nothing. Then he sighed, setting his mug down. "It's not that simple. You left, and I learned how to live without you. Now you're back. And it feels like—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Like what?" she pressed gently. "Like you're reopening a wound I thought had healed," he admitted, his voice raw. Emma's throat tightened. She had not considered how much her absence might have hurt him, how it might still hurt. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Alex. I was just trying to survive." He turned to her then, his green eyes filled with a mix of frustration and something softer. "I know, but it doesn't make it any easier." They sat in silence for a while, the clinking of plates and hum of conversation around them, a distant backdrop. Finally, Jamie's voice broke through. "Well, look at this," she said, setting 2 plates of pie in front of them. "My treat. Y'all could use a little sweetness." Alex smirked faintly, and Emma couldn't help but smile back. Later that afternoon, Emma walked to the creek again, hoping to clear her mind. She had taken Jamie's words to heart. Kindness might not erase the past, but it could help pave the way forward. As she sat on a familiar rock by the water's edge, she heard the crunch of footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Alex approaching, his hands in his jacket pockets. "Couldn't resist the old hangout spot?" she asked, attempting levity. Alex shrugged, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "It's quiet out here. Helps me think." He sat down on a nearby log, the silence between them more comfortable now. They watched the water flow, neither speaking until Alex broke the quiet. "You remember when we built that little raft?" he asked, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. Emma laughed softly. "Yeah, it sank within 5 minutes." "Still got us halfway across," Alex said, his smile widening. Emma smiled too, the memory warming her. For a moment, they were kids again, their worries as fleeting as the ripples in the creek. "I missed this," she admitted, her voice soft. Alex looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Me too." They sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon, the golden light fading into twilight. For the first time in years, Emma felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps bridges could be rebuilt, even over troubled waters. The next day, Emma woke early, the pale morning light filtering through the thin curtains in her childhood bedroom. The mattress beneath her was lumpy, the room itself a relic of her teenage years, posters curling at the edges, a forgotten stack of books on the nightstand. She stared at the ceiling, replaying yesterday's unexpected moment of connection with Alex by the creek. It had been a small step, but it felt like the first real bridge between them. After a quick breakfast, Emma decided she needed to do something productive. The house weighed on her, both literally with its sagging beams and metaphorically with its lingering ghosts. She remembered Jamie mentioning a community volunteer program at the local elementary school. It was worth a try, she thought, if only to get out of her own head. At Blue Ridge Elementary, Emma stood at the front office counter, filling out a short form under the watchful eye of the school secretary, Mrs. Abernathy. "We always need extra hands," Mrs. Abernathy said, handing her a visitor's badge, "especially with the reading program. The kids love it when new faces come in." Emma nodded, the nerves stirring in her stomach. "I'd like to help however I can." The secretary smiled and led her down a hallway, the faint echo of children's voices growing louder. At the end of the hall, Mrs. Abernathy opened a door to a brightly decorated classroom. "Ms. Winters, this is Emma Caldwell," Mrs. Abernathy said. "She's here to help with the reading program today." The teacher, a young woman with warm brown eyes, greeted Emma with a firm handshake. "We're so glad to have you. The kids will be thrilled." Emma scanned the room, her eyes landing on a boy sitting alone near the back. His curly hair hung low over his face as he doodled on the corner of his worksheet. He looked up briefly, catching her eye, before quickly returning to his drawing. "That's Marcus," Ms. Winters whispered. "He's a bit of a tough nut, but he's got a good heart." Something about Marcus pulled at Emma. She saw pieces of her younger self in the way he held himself closed off, wary, and just a little bit defiant. Later that afternoon, Emma found herself at the reading circle, a half-moon of eager faces waiting for the story to begin. Marcus sat slightly apart from the others, his arms crossed. Emma picked up the book Ms. Winters had handed her, The Adventures of Rusty the Fox. She began reading, her voice steady, but gentle. As the story unfolded, she noticed Marcus inching closer, his curiosity outweighing his reluctance. By the time she finished, he was sitting just a few feet away. "Do you like stories about animals?" Emma asked, as the other kids filed out for recess. Marcus shrugged, his eyes darting toward the door. "I guess," Emma smiled. "I used to love them when I was your age. My favorite was about a dog who got lost but found his way home. Do you have a favorite?" He hesitated, then mumbled, "There's one about a bear. He goes on adventures." "Sounds like a good one," Emma said, keeping her tone light. "Maybe next time you can tell me more about it." Marcus looked at her for a moment, his expression softening, before he bolted for the door. That evening, Emma walked home with a renewed sense of purpose. She couldn't stop thinking about Marcus and the flicker of vulnerability she had seen in him. It reminded her of herself as a child searching for safety, for someone who would listen. The thought stayed with her as she reached her father's house. She pushed the door open, setting her bag on the counter, when a knock startled her. Alex stood on the porch, a toolbox in hand. "Figured I'd take another look at that roof," he said, his voice casual. Emma stepped aside, grateful for the company. They worked together, Emma handing Alex tools as he inspected the damage. She noticed how his hands moved with practiced ease, his focus unwavering. "Thank you," she said as they wrapped up. "For what?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "For not giving up on this place. On me." Alex paused, leaning against the railing. "It's not easy to forget what we had, Emma, and it's not easy to forgive what we lost. But maybe it's worth trying." Emma nodded, a lump rising in her throat. "I think so too." As Alex left, she stood on the porch, watching him drive away. For the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope, not just for them, but for herself. The next day, Emma returned to the school. Ms. Winters greeted her warmly, and Marcus even offered a shy wave from across the room. During a break, Emma sat with him at a table, helping him with a drawing he was working on. "That's a great bear," she said, pointing to the sketch. Marcus shrugged, but there was a faint smile on his lips. "You know," Emma said, "I used to draw all the time. My dad kept some of my old pictures. I didn't think he would, but he did." Marcus looked up, curious. "Really?" "Yeah," Emma said. "Sometimes people surprise you." Marcus didn't reply, but his expression softened. As the day ended, Marcus handed Emma the drawing of the bear. "For you," he said quickly before running off. Emma held the paper close, her heart swelling. In Marcus's small gesture, she saw the beginnings of trust, of connection, and in that moment, she realized that small acts of kindness, like Jamie's at the diner, Alex's quiet repairs, or Marcus's simple gift, had the power to rebuild what had been broken. The drawing Marcus had given her was still on Emma's kitchen counter the next morning, the corners held down by an old coffee mug. She couldn't stop looking at it, the bear, slightly crooked but full of determination, surrounded by trees. It reminded her of her own sketches as a child. There was a message in Marcus's gesture, one that Emma couldn't ignore. He had offered her a piece of himself, just as Alex had, in his quiet way, by helping with the house. The thought gave her courage as she set out for the day. But courage was not enough to stave off the past. Emma's car sputtered to a stop just outside Brennan's auto repair. She groaned, stepping out to inspect the smoke curling from under the hood. It was another reminder of how her life in Atlanta had moved too fast for proper maintenance. The garage smelled of motor oil and rubber. Inside, Alex stood by a lift, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. When he saw her, his eyebrows lifted in mild surprise. "You're here early," he said. Emma gestured to her car. "It decided to give up on me. Thought I'd see if you could work your magic." Alex smirked faintly and grabbed his toolbox. "Pop the hood. Let's see what we've got." As Alex tinkered, Emma glanced around the shop. Tools were organized on the walls, parts lined shelves, and the faint hum of classic rock played from a small radio. It was a stark contrast to her father's house, which still felt stuck in time. "Looks like a busted radiator," Alex said, pulling her attention back. "You'll need a replacement. I can get one in a day or two." Emma nodded. "Thanks, Alex." Before he could reply, the sound of heavy boots echoed behind them. Henry Brennan, Alex's father, stepped into the shop. His sharp gaze landed on Emma, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, if it isn't Emma Caldwell," Henry said, his tone cold. Emma tensed. She had always known Henry disapproved of her, though he had rarely said so outright. It was his piercing looks, the way he grunted disapprovingly when she came around, that made his feelings clear. "Morning, Mr. Brennan," she said cautiously. Henry folded his arms, his gaze flicking to Alex. "This what you're spending your time on? Fixing her problems?" "Dad," Alex said warningly, his voice low. Henry ignored him. "You remember how things were when she left, don't you? The mess she left behind? And now she's back, expecting everyone to forget." "Enough," Alex snapped, his tone firm. "I said I'd handle it." Emma felt her cheeks burn, shame and anger twisting together. She wanted to defend herself, to shout that she hadn't asked for Alex's help, but the words caught in her throat. Henry turned to her, his expression hard. "Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt, Emma. You should have stayed where you went." Before Emma could respond, Alex grabbed Henry's arm and steered him toward the office at the back of the shop. The door closed behind them, muffling their argument, though the sharp tones of their voices still carried. Emma stood by her car, her chest tight. She had expected resistance from the town, but hearing it so plainly from Henry stung. When Alex returned, his face was tense. "I'm sorry about that." Emma forced a weak smile. "It's fine. I should get going." She turned to leave, but Alex stopped her. "Emma," he said, his voice softer now. "He's not right. People can change. Things can get better." She looked at him, her throat tightening again. "Can they?" Alex held her gaze. "They can, if you want them to." Emma walked home, her mind racing. The weight of Henry's words lingered, but so did Alex's. Could things really get better? Could the bonds she had broken ever truly be repaired? By the time she reached the house, the answers still eluded her. The next day, Emma returned to Blue Ridge Elementary. Marcus greeted her with a small wave, a hint of excitement in his eyes as he held up another drawing. "This one's a fox," he said, handing it to her. Emma smiled. "It's wonderful, Marcus. You're really talented." He shrugged, but there was pride in his expression. "You think so?" "I do," she said. "Have you ever thought about making a story to go with your drawings?" Marcus tilted his head, considering. "Like a book?" "Exactly like a book," Emma said. "You could write about your bear and his adventures." Marcus's eyes lit up. "I think I'd like that." For the rest of the session, they worked on the story together, Marcus dictating as Emma wrote. The bear was brave, facing challenges in the forest and making unlikely friends along the way. As they worked, Emma realized something. Marcus wasn't just telling a story. He was sharing pieces of himself, his fears, and his hopes. It was a gift, one she hadn't expected, but deeply appreciated. Later that evening, Em returned to the diner for dinner. Jamie greeted her with her usual cheer, sliding into the booth opposite her. "You look like you've had a day," Jamie said. Emma chuckled softly. "That's one way to put it." Jamie leaned forward, her expression turning serious. "Don't let people like Henry get in your head. That man's been bitter since before you left." "It's not just him," Emma admitted. "It's this place, these memories. It feels like every corner I turn, there's a reminder of something I did wrong." Jamie reached across the table, placing a hand over Emma's. "Honey, we've all got ghosts, but if you keep running from them, you'll never give yourself a chance to make peace." Emma nodded, Jamie's words sinking in. She realized she didn't just want to make peace with the town. She wanted to make peace with herself. As the evening wore on, Emma left the diner with a renewed determination. Maybe Alex was right. Maybe things could get better. But it would take work, and she was ready to try. The next morning, Emma was determined to move forward. She spent the early hours tidying her father's house, clearing away years of neglect. It felt cathartic small steps to reclaim the space as her own. Midway through scrubbing the kitchen sink, her phone buzzed with a message from Jamie. "Community lunch at the church today. Volunteers needed. You in?" Emma hesitated, then texted back, I'll be there." The church hall was bustling when Emma arrived, the aroma of simmering stew and baked bread filling the air. Long tables were lined with food, while volunteers moved between stations, preparing meals for the community. Jamie spotted Emma near the entrance and waved her over. "Glad you came. We can always use extra hands." Emma smiled, slipping into the rhythm of the event. She joined a team assembling meal boxes, the hum of activity around her both energizing and comforting. It reminded her of how connected this town had once felt before she left. As Emma worked, she noticed Alex across the room, stacking boxes into his truck for delivery. She caught his eye briefly, offering a tentative wave. To her surprise, he nodded back, his expression softening. After the last meals were packed, Jamie clapped her hands for attention. "Okay, folks, time to distribute. We've got 5 stops, and we'll need some extra drivers." Emma stepped forward. "I can help." Jamie grinned. "That's the spirit. Alex, why don't you take Emma along for the first route? 2 sets of hands make light work." Emma tensed, glancing at Alex, but he only shrugged. "Sure." They loaded the truck in silence, the boxes rattling softly as Alex pulled onto the main road. The tension between them was palpable, though Emma was determined to break through it. "This is nice," she said, breaking the silence. "Helping people, I mean." Alex nodded, his eyes on the road. "It's something my mom used to do. She believed everyone deserved a little kindness, no matter their situation." Emma hesitated, unsure how to respond. She remembered Alex's mother, a warm and generous woman who had often slipped extra cookies into Emma's hands when she visited. "She was a good person," Emma said finally. "I always admired her." Alex glanced at her, his expression softening. "She liked you, thought you had a good heart." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. "I'm not sure everyone would agree." Alex sighed, his grip tightening on the wheel. "People hold on to grudges longer than they should, but that doesn't mean they're right." Their first stop was a small house on the edge of town. The front yard was overgrown, and the paint was peeling, but the curtains twitched as Alex knocked on the door. An elderly man answered, his face lighting up when he saw the meal boxes. "Bless you," he said, his voice trembling. "I wasn't sure how I'd get through the week." Alex smiled, handing over the boxes. "Take care, Mr. Pruitt." Back in the truck, Emma stared out the window, lost in thought. The man's gratitude had been so genuine, so raw. It struck her how easy it was to overlook the struggles of others when consumed by her own. They made 2 more stops, each interaction leaving Emma with a deeper appreciation for the power of simple kindness. At their final destination, a modest home with a sagging porch, a young woman answered the door, her toddler clinging to her leg. She looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed with worry. "Thank you," she said, accepting the boxes. "It's been a hard month." Alex crouched down, pulling a small toy car from his jacket pocket and handing it to the toddler. "Here you go, buddy." The child's face lit up, and the mother's eyes filled with tears. "You didn't have to." "It's nothing," Alex said gently. Emma watched the exchange, her chest tightening. Alex had always been like this, quietly thoughtful, offering small gestures that meant everything. As they drove back to the church, Emma finally spoke. "You're good at this." Alex glanced at her, confused. "At what?" "Making people feel seen," she said. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It doesn't take much to show people you care." That evening, Emma sat on the porch of her father's house, reflecting on the day. The weight of her own struggles felt lighter, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. She thought of Marcus, whose walls were slowly coming down. She thought of the people they had delivered meals to, each one a reminder that everyone carried unseen burdens. And she thought of Alex, whose kindness had never faltered, even in the face of her mistakes. For the first time in years, Emma felt something close to hope. The sun filtered through the thin curtains of Emma's childhood room as she awoke the next morning. The warmth of the previous day lingered, bolstered by the sense of connection she had felt during the meal deliveries with Alex. It was as though she had glimpsed the community she had abandoned and begun to understand its resilience. Her thoughts turned to Marcus, his cautious smiles, and his quiet determination. She was beginning to see a pattern, the same fear and hesitation she had felt as a child reflected in his eyes. She felt a pull to do more, to ensure he had the support she often wished for growing up. At Blue Ridge Elementary, Ms. Winters greeted Emma with a smile. "I think Marcus has been looking forward to seeing you," she said. Emma felt a flicker of pride at the thought. She stepped into the classroom and spotted Marcus at a table, his head bent over another drawing. "Hey, Marcus," she said, approaching him. He looked up, his face lighting up as he held out a new picture. This time, it was a rabbit standing next to the bear. "Another character for your story?" Emma asked, taking the drawing. Marcus nodded. "They're friends now. They help each other." Emma sat beside him. "That's a great idea. Everyone needs a friend they can count on." Marcus hesitated, his pencil hovering over the page. "Do you think it's okay to ask for help, even if you're supposed to be strong?" Emma's heart ached at the question. She had spent years convincing herself that strength meant carrying burdens alone, only to realize it had left her isolated. "It's more than okay," she said gently. "Asking for help doesn't make you weak. It means you're brave enough to know you can't do everything by yourself." Marcus didn't respond right away, but she saw the wheels turning in his mind. Later that afternoon, Emma visited Marcus's home for the first time. Ms. Winters had mentioned that his family might need extra support, and Emma had offered to check in. The house was small and worn, the paint peeling and the yard cluttered with toys. Marcus answered the door, his face lighting up when he saw Emma. "Hi, Marcus," she said. "Is your mom home?" He nodded, disappearing into the house to fetch her. When Cynthia, Marcus's mother, appeared, Emma immediately saw the weight she carried. Her shoulders were slouched, and dark circles rimmed her eyes. Yet she greeted Emma with a polite smile. "Thanks for stopping by," Cynthia said, stepping aside to let Emma in. Inside, the house was clean but sparse. Marcus's younger siblings played on the floor with mismatched toys, their laughter a stark contrast to Cynthia's weary expression. "I wanted to check in," Emma said. "Marcus is doing great in the reading program, and I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed." Cynthia hesitated, her hands twisting in front of her. "It's been a lot lately. The heater broke last week, and I've been trying to save up to fix it. It's just one thing after another." Emma's heart sank. The nights had been chilly, and she couldn't imagine how difficult it must be to keep the kids warm without heat. "Let me see if I can help," Emma said without thinking. Cynthia looked surprised. "Oh no, I couldn't ask." "You're not asking," Emma said firmly. "This town is about helping each other, right? Let me see what I can do." That evening, Emma called Alex. "Hey," she said when he answered. "Do you still know anyone who fixes heaters?" Alex hesitated. "Why? Is something wrong with yours?" "No, it's Marcus's family," Emma explained. "Their heater's broken, and they're struggling to get it fixed." Alex was quiet for a moment. "I can take a look. No promises, but I'll see what I can do." "Thank you," Emma said, relief washing over her. The next day, Alex and Emma arrived at Marcus's house with tools in hand. Cynthia seemed overwhelmed by their presence, but grateful nonetheless. "You really didn't have to do this," she said, as Alex knelt by the heater, examining it with a flashlight. "It's no trouble," Alex replied. "Just needs a little patchwork." As he worked, Emma sat with Marcus and his siblings, helping them with their homework. The kids were lively and bright, their laughter filling the room despite the challenges their family faced. When Alex finished, he stood and wiped his hands on a rag. "All set. It should hold up for the rest of the season, but I'll check back to make sure it's running smooth." Cynthia's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Alex said simply. As they walked back to the truck, Emma glanced at Alex. "You didn't have to come all the way out here." "Thank you." Alex shrugged, his hands in his pockets. "People helped my mom when she needed it. I'm just paying it forward." Emma smiled, her chest swelling with a mix of gratitude and admiration. "Marcus was asking about what it means to be strong," she said after a moment. Alex raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell him?" "That strength doesn't mean doing everything alone," Emma replied. "It means knowing when to ask for help." Alex nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Sounds about right." That evening, back at her father's house, Emma sat on the porch with a cup of tea. She thought about Marcus, his family, and the unexpected kindness Alex had shown. It struck her how much people's lives intertwined, how small acts of care could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Emma made a quiet promise to herself. She would keep building those connections, keep showing up for the people who needed her. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The heater repair had sparked something in Emma. For the first time since returning to Blue Ridge, she felt she was taking tangible steps to rebuild connections. Her thoughts often drifted to Marcus's smile and the gratitude in Cynthia's eyes. The small moments carried weight, showing her that kindness, no matter how simple, could create profound change. Yet, there was one connection she had yet to mend: her bond with Alex. That afternoon, Emma decided to visit Alex at the garage. The air smelled of gasoline and motor oil as she stepped inside, her boots echoing against the concrete floor. Alex stood under a car hoisted on a lift, his grease-streaked hands busy with a wrench. "Got another car for me to fix?" he asked without looking up, a teasing lilt in his voice. Emma smiled faintly. "Not this time. I thought maybe you could take a break." Alex straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, his brow furrowed in curiosity. "A break for what?" "Come on," she said, tilting her head toward the door. "I've got something to show you." He hesitated, glancing at the car, then back at her. Finally, he sighed, hanging the rag on a hook. "Fine, but this better not be some kind of wild goose chase." The air was crisp as they drove toward the outskirts of town, the truck's engine rumbling steadily. Emma kept her destination a surprise, enjoying the rare flickers of humor in Alex's expression as he tried to guess where they were headed. When they arrived, Alex's confusion deepened. "The old bridge?" he asked, stepping out of the truck. The wooden bridge spanned a narrow creek, its planks weathered but sturdy. It was a place they had often come as kids, skipping rocks and daring each other to wade in the icy water below. Emma leaned against the railing, her hands gripping the wood. "I used to come here to think," she said, "about what I wanted, what I was afraid of. It always felt like a place where anything was possible." Alex joined her, his gaze on the water. "We spent hours here. I haven't been back in years." Emma turned to him, her voice soft. "I wanted to bring you here because I need to say something. About us." Alex tensed slightly, but he didn't pull away. "I know I hurt you when I left," Emma continued. "I've been thinking about it a lot, about how I didn't just leave this town, I left the people who cared about me. You cared about me." Alex was quiet for a long moment, the sound of the creek filling the space between them. "I did," he said finally. "And when you left, it felt like I wasn't enough to make you stay." Emma's throat tightened. "It wasn't about you, Alex. It was about me. I was scared of becoming stuck, of turning into my dad. I thought leaving was the only way to escape." Alex's gaze remained on the water, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. "I get it, Emma. I do. I just wish you had talked to me before you left. Maybe we could have figured it out together." "I wish I had too," she admitted. "I was selfish, and I'm sorry. I can't change the past, but I want to make things right now. Alex finally looked at her, his green eyes filled with a mix of pain and something softer hope, maybe. You're here now, he said simply. Emma smiled, tears pricking her eyes. I am. That evening, Emma stopped by Mrs. Jenkins' house. The elderly woman greeted her with a warm hug, ushering her inside to a cozy living room that smelled of cinnamon and pine. I was wondering when you'd stop by, Mrs. Jenkins said, settling into her armchair. Emma sat across from her, cradling a cup of tea. I wanted to thank you for everything. You've always been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it. Mrs. Jenkins waved her hand dismissively. Oh, hush. You've always deserved kindness, Emma. You just didn't know how to let yourself receive it. Emma chuckled softly. You might be right about that. Mrs. Jenkins leaned forward, her expression turning serious. You're doing good things, Emma. For Marcus, for his family, for yourself. But don't forget being kind to others starts with being kind to yourself. The words stayed with Emma as she walked home, the cool night air biting her cheeks. The next day, Emma returned to Marcus's home. Cynthia greeted her warmly, the lines of worry on her face slightly eased. I wanted to check on you, Emma said. We're doing okay, Cynthia replied, glancing at the heater Alex had repaired. Thanks to you and Alex. Emma crouched to talk to Marcus, who was busy coloring at the kitchen table. Hey Marcus, how's the story coming? He grinned, holding up a page filled with colorful illustrations. The bear and the rabbit found a cave to live in. They're safe now. Emma smiled, her chest tightening with pride. That's amazing. I can't wait to see how it ends. As she left, Marcus tugged on her sleeve. Emma? She turned, crouching to meet his gaze. Thanks for helping my mom, he said softly. Emma felt tears sting her eyes. Anytime, Marcus. That's what friends do. That evening, Emma sat on the porch of her father's house, watching the stars appear one by one. She thought of the bridges she was rebuilding with Alex, with Marcus and his family, and with herself. The past couldn't be undone, but maybe it didn't need to be. It was part of her, shaping who she was and who she could become. And for the first time in years, she felt ready to move forward. The sound of cheerful voices echoed through the town square as Emma approached the Blue Ridge Community Festival. The annual event was a celebration of all things local food, crafts, music, and most importantly, a sense of unity. It had been years since Emma had attended, but this time she felt a pull to be part of the community again. The square was alive with activity. Children ran between brightly colored booths, their laughter mingling with the upbeat tunes of a local bluegrass band. Vendors called out to passers-by, offering samples of homemade jams and freshly baked bread. Emma spotted Jamie by a booth, decorated with hand-painted signs advertising homemade candles. Emma, Jamie called, waving her over. Look at you, out and about. You're starting to fit right back in. Emma smiled, feeling the warmth of Jamie's words. It feels good to be here. Better than good, Jamie said, nudging her playfully. You're finally where you belong. As the day went on, Emma found herself moving through the crowd, exchanging smiles and small talk with people she hadn't seen in years. It was strange, but comforting, to be recognized, even by those she once thought had written her off. At the far end of the square, she found Marcus sitting with his siblings at a craft table. He was hunched over a piece of paper, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated on his drawing. Hey, Marcus, Emma said, kneeling beside him. He looked up, his face lighting up. Emma, look, I'm making a sign for the story. She leaned in to examine the colorful letters, the adventures of Bear and Rabbit. It's perfect, she said. I'm so proud of you. Cynthia approached, carrying plates of food. He's been talking about the story all morning, she said, her voice filled with pride. Emma smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the connection they had built. Later, Emma wandered toward the stage where the local school was performing a short play. The small wooden platform was decorated with paper flowers, and children in handmade costumes waited nervously for their turn to shine. The play began, a simple story about friendship and overcoming challenges. Emma's heart swelled as Marcus stepped onto the stage, wearing a bear costume that was slightly too big. He delivered his lines with a quiet confidence, his voice carrying over the crowd. "You don't have to be alone," Marcus said, his tone earnest. "We can face the forest together." The audience erupted into applause as the play ended, and Emma wiped a tear from her cheek. Seeing Marcus shine in this moment felt like a victory, not just for him, but for all the small steps they had taken together. After the play, Emma found Alex by the food stalls, chatting with a vendor. He looked relaxed, his usual guarded expression replaced by a rare ease. "Hey," she said, approaching him. He turned, his face brightening slightly. "Hey yourself. Enjoying the festival?" "I am," she said. "It's good to see everyone coming together like this." Alex nodded, glancing at the stage where Marcus was taking a bow with his classmates. "You've done a lot for that kid, you know." Emma shook her head. "He's done just as much for me. Seeing him grow, it's reminded me what's important." They stood in silence for a moment, the energy of the festival buzzing around them. Finally, Alex spoke. "You've changed," he said quietly. Emma met his gaze. "I had to. Coming back here, seeing what I left behind, it made me realize how much I was running from myself." Alex's expression softened. "Well, it suits you." A warmth spread through Emma at his words. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. "I don't want to run anymore." Alex hesitated, then clasped her hand in his. "Then don't." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the festival continued, the square glowing with string lights and the soft hum of conversations. Emma stood with Alex, their hands intertwined, watching as Marcus and his siblings played tag near the fountain. For the first time in years, Emma felt whole. She had faced the pieces of her past she had long avoided, and in doing so, she had found something she hadn't known. She was missing a sense of belonging, of purpose, and of hope. The morning after the festival dawned quiet and clear. Emma stood on the porch of her father's house, a mug of coffee warming her hands. The world felt still, as though holding its breath after the energy of the day before. She thought about the moments that had led her here. Marcus's triumphant smile on stage, the soft squeeze of Alex's hand, Jamie's knowing grin as they passed her on their way out. These small connections had anchored her in a way she hadn't thought possible. As Emma sipped her coffee, Alex's truck pulled into the driveway. He stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel, a relaxed smile on his face. "Morning," he said, climbing the steps. "Morning," Emma replied, her own smile widening. "What brings you here so early?" "I thought we could take a walk," Alex said. Emma raised an eyebrow. "A walk?" He gestured toward the woods behind the house, where the sunlight filtered through the trees. "There's something I want to show you." The trail wound through the familiar woods where Emma and Alex had spent countless childhood afternoons. The leaves crunched beneath their feet, and the air smelled of pine and earth. As they walked, Alex spoke. "You've done a lot since you came back," he said. "For Marcus, his family, the community." Emma shook her head. "It's nothing compared to what this place has done for me. Coming back, seeing everything I've missed, I think I needed this more than I realized." Alex stopped near a clearing where a small stream trickled over moss-covered rocks. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "You've changed, Emma," he said, "but in the best way. You've always had a good heart, it just took some time to find your way back to it." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. "I couldn't have done it alone," she said. "You helped me see what I was missing." Alex smiled, his gaze softening. "We've all got things to learn. I guess that's why we need each other." Later that afternoon, Emma visited Marcus's house again, this time with a small gift wrapped in colorful paper. Marcus opened the door, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Emma!" he exclaimed. "I have something for you," she said, handing him the package. Marcus tore it open, revealing a blank sketchbook and a set of colored pencils. "For your story," Emma said. "Now you can keep all your adventures in one place." Marcus beamed. "Thank you. I'm going to start right now." Cynthia appeared in the doorway, smiling warmly. "You've made quite an impression on him," she said. Emma shook her head. "He's made just as much of an impression on me." That evening, Emma sat on the porch of her father's house once more, the fading light casting long shadows across the yard. Alex joined her, a plate of cookies from Mrs. Jenkins in his hands. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars appear one by one. "You're staying, aren't you?" Alex asked, breaking the quiet. Emma nodded. "I think I am. There's so much here I didn't see before, so many people, so much life. I don't want to miss it anymore." Alex smiled, a quiet understanding passing between them. As the night deepened, Emma felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She had faced her past, found her place in the present, and opened herself to a future filled with possibility. For the first time in a long time, Emma knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The cool breeze swept through the town square as Emma walked hand in hand with Alex, passing by familiar faces who now greeted her warmly. Marcus's laugh rang out in the distance as he played with his siblings near the fountain. The community had become more than a place for Emma. It was home. Emma paused, glancing at the glowing streetlights. "I used to think leaving was the only way to find myself," she said softly, "but coming back, being here, it's shown me who I really am." Alex squeezed her hand gently. "Sometimes we just need a second chance, Emma." Looking around, Emma saw not just the town, but the people, their kindness, their resilience, their willingness to welcome her back despite the past. A warmth spread through her as she realized the truth. No one gets through life alone. She turned to Alex, her voice firm. "I'm staying. This is where I'm meant to be." Alex smiled, pulling her into a hug as the town lights twinkled around them. "Thank you for joining me on Emma's journey of self-discovery and the power of kindness." Her story is a reminder that no matter how far we stray, it's never too late to rebuild connections, heal old wounds, and embrace a brighter future. If you enjoyed The Weight of Kindness and want to experience more heartfelt stories about perseverance, hope, and the strength of community, please consider subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you'll never miss another inspiring story, and you'll help us continue sharing tales that resonate with the heart and soul. Subscribe now and become part of our storytelling family. Together, let's keep spreading kindness, one story at a time. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.